Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everyone. It is V, the Guerrilla Economist, and we have with us the one and only man who needs no introduction whatsoever. And if you don't know who he is, you've been living under a rock. It's the one and only Harley Schlanger. Harley, how are you, sir?
I'm doing fine, V. Good to talk with you.
Great talking to you. We have the color revolution slash the great coup of the United States of America active and at play. Harley, what is the latest that has transpired?
Well, my associate, Barbara Boyd, who's an absolutely excellent researcher, has just written a three-part series, which is called Ukraine Gate, the coup against Donald Trump, part or phase three. And what she writes about is the details of this whole unfolding Ukraine situation. And I think what's come out in the last few days, partly with the Paul Sperry identification of this Eric Ciaramella as the so-called whistleblower, we can see why Adam Schiff is trying to shunt him off into the basement somewhere, because he is a walking interface between the people who carried out the February 2014 coup in Ukraine, the corrupt Biden operation, and Biden was part of that coup as Obama's frontman for Ukraine. Uh, Ciaramella worked for Brennan. Brennan then sent him to the National Security Council, where he worked under Susan Rice, who was part of the Russiagate story. He worked there with Biden as a Ukraine expert, and then he stayed there when Trump first came in. He left when he was suspected of leaking, and then he became the so-called whistleblower without having heard the call and without properly going through the procedures to be a whistleblower, met with Schiff's people, drafted a statement, probably by Schiff, which became the initiating cause of the so-called Ukraine investigation against Donald Trump. Now, since they've gotten a parade of diplomats and intelligence personnel to back up the original story, they now say they don't need him. But people like William Taylor, who is supposedly one of the star witnesses that Trump was doing a quid pro quo, Taylor was part of the Ukraine operation under Kerry, Victoria Nuland, the old Hillary Clinton State Department. So
Right.
if you really lift the cover on this, what you see is that from 2014 to 2019, you have one continuing operation, whether you call it deep state, City of London, the Obama intelligence community, however you label it. It's the same network that has been tried to defeat Trump in the first phase, the so-called Russiagate phase, tried to impeach him initially with the Mueller investigation, which was the second phase, and now they're at phase three, and this is the third strike. And if Trump and his allies in the Congress do this thing properly, not only will they shoot this final effort down, but the Democrats won't have a leg to stand on in 2020. And more importantly, with the Barr and Durham investigation coming to fruition, we probably will have the goods to lock up people like Brennan, uh, Clapper, Comey, the whole crew, as well as to shut down the British side of this, the Sir Richard Dearloffe, Christopher Steele, as well as the operation in Ukraine of the neo Nazis and others. So, this is, in a sense, a great moment in history. And let's hope that we have the ability to follow it through and take it all the way to its proper conclusion.
It's amazing, man. It truly is because you got this rumor blower or gossip blower who blew a gossip instead of actual information, and and he did it with who? With Schiff behind closed doors, no cross examination, written testimony. It's such insanity, man.
Well, then the vote they just took, they said, okay, we will allow the Republicans to subpoena some of the documents and testimony, provided we approve it. So in the resolution that passed, Schiff and the majority of the Democrats on the committee have to approve any Republican cross examination.
Yeah.
So how is that acceptable? How does that take away from this being a star chamber?
It's such mediocrity and criminality at such a high level, Harley. It really is.
Well, and the thing you have to look at here is what is it they're trying to block with this? Are they really upset that Donald Trump is investigating Joe Biden? I mean, why would that be a problem? Wasn't there such a thing as opposition research into Trump?
Oh yeah,
Didn't
that
Democrats in 2016 buy a fake report written by a top British spook? I mean, why is that suddenly a crime if in fact Trump were doing that with Biden? But
well, that
I
only
think,
works one way.
well, there's a legitimate question whether that's what he was doing. I
Mhm.
think what Trump was doing with Barr and Durham was digging into the whole operation of the regime change war in Ukraine,
Yep.
which fits with what Trump is trying to do, which is to discredit this whole idea that the American intelligence community and its allies in the Five Eyes have a right to overthrow any government in the world that they wish, have a right to tee up Russia and China for war if they wish, have a right to destroy any nation that tries to act as a sovereign economic entity. That's what Trump is attacking here. And that's why they're trying to block him and change the story to did Trump abuse his power? And I think the president is, I watched the Tupelo, Mississippi rally, and people who say the Americans aren't going to support Trump are not watching these things.
No.
Trump had incredible support from the crowd. Now,
Yep.
granted, there are people out there who want to get rid of him because they don't know what the issues are and they've been brainwashed by the media. But people like Schiff and others are on the thinnest of thin ice. And someone's got to saw a hole in that ice and let them sink to the bottom of the ocean because this is a crew which, if they have their way, they're not just going to impeach Trump, they're going to have us at war with Russia and China.
Yeah, it's the level of depravity and sanity mixed with hubris is a very dangerous combination. Harley, I was thinking to myself, the same characters, the same exact characters, British intel, American intel, backed by the American U.S. State Department, and NGOs, all controlled and funded by Soros, were the key players involved in the Maidan in Ukraine, as well as they are the key players involved in the coup that is taking place in Washington, D.C. against a sitting, duly elected president of the United States.
And they're the same players that are moving to a global synthetic hegemonic currency and a green financial bubble to
Yep.
try and prop up the trillions of dollars of worthless assets that they've placed in the Federal Reserve and the European Central Bank, the Bank of England, and on the books of the major commercial banks in this country that can only be protected by an unending bailout, which sooner or later Trump is going to end.
Mm-hmm.
So, this is, you have to look at what the end game is. The end game is not to get rid of Donald Trump so we can have economic justice or to end the disparity between the rich and the poor or to start rebuilding US infrastructure and manufacturing. The end here is to allow a global banker's dictatorship which funds unlimited war. So, this is the message people have to get. It's important to know the details. And I mentioned this new report by my colleague Barbara Boyd at LaRouchePAC.com. You can pick up the three-part PDF of the Ukraine Gate story. It will give you all the details. And those people who like details, and it's worth knowing because we can pin it down practically almost to the day-to-day basis that this guy Ciardamella was working with this network. But once you get that, then you have to ask yourself, why are they doing it? What's their end game? And their end game is to support a global banker's dictatorship, to destroy economic sovereignty, to shut down manufacturing in the United States and Europe. We were talking before the program about what's happening in Germany to the auto industry. They're destroying it. It's being dismantled. And on November 26th, there will be the largest march in history of German farmers
Right.
protesting what they're trying to do to the European agriculture through the European Union green policy and their anti-food policy. So we're seeing a global rebellion against this neoliberal neocon policy. And in the United States, I think, we may have 40% of the electorate against Trump, 40% for Trump, maybe 20% not sure. We've got to win over the other 20% to smash the people who are out to get him,
Yeah.
because their ultimate goal is something that not any real American could ever support.
Yeah, exactly correct. The thing is, these guys, they don't have a leg to stand on, Harley. Number one, I think it's going to be. I mean, my God, they have no position except derail Trump, and I think they're doing this in such a feverish pitch at this point because something is about to happen to them, Harley. I am starting to sense, and I don't know exactly how it will play out. I don't know exactly what the inner workings of this counter move is. But I think the noose is starting to tighten around the neck of some very key individuals, that being Brennan, Clapper, Rice, Lynch, Obama, Comey, Strzok, McCabe, Page,
Yeah.
Clinton.
Well, and here's the other thing to think about on this. You take a look at what Brennan has been involved in, and you see that Brennan has been a supporter of the jihadis that the CIA was getting funds from the US government to defeat. They were supposed to defeat the jihadis, but the origin of ISIS came out of the CIA torture program and the war, the phony war on terror, which was literally a cover to produce more terrorists. That's what Obama was doing. And what happened? Michael Flynn exposed it.
Yep.
And they went after Flynn. Now, here's something that came out today that's quite fascinating. The media is trying to mock Manafort because they're saying that Manafort was telling Trump that the real operation in the 2016 election was not the Russians interfering, but the Ukrainians. And they're saying, oh, doesn't this prove how crazy they are? No, it shows exactly that Manafort knew what was going on, and that's why they targeted him. That Manafort, when his support for Yanukovych was not 100% support for Putin, it was support for Ukraine to play off both East and West for the benefit of Ukraine. And that's why Yanukovych was entertaining the prospect of joining the EU, while at the same time recognizing the importance of the Russian trade basis of the Ukrainian economy. When he was overthrown, what happened? The Ukraine was totally dependent on the EU, and the EU did nothing except allow the oligarchs to come in the same way they did in Russia in the 1990s and loot the country. So Manafort was absolutely right in his support for Yanukovych against the Western privateers. And he was also right in the fact that Ukrainian intelligence, which was largely supported by the Stefan Bandera brigades of the old Ukrainian SS units from World War II, that this is who Hillary Clinton and Victoria Nuland and George Soros were supporting. So do you think they want this story to come out? Of course not. And every time someone brings up the role of neo-Nazis in the Ukrainian security forces, they're mocked. Well, this is more conspiracy theory. But I don't know if people had a chance to see this the other day, but Larry Johnson, who writes often for Consortium News and an ex-CIA analyst, one of the veteran intelligence professionals for Sanity, Johnson did a evening briefing on LaRouche PAC.
Yeah.
And he said, isn't it ironic that LaRouche was always called a conspiracy theorist when in fact he was identifying facts that showed there actually was a conspiracy, and that the people who were attacking him as a conspiracy theorist developed their own conspiracies about Russia and about Putin and Trump.
Yep.
And so I think when people sort through all of this, hopefully at some safe place, maybe 5 years from now, we'll be able to look back with people like Brennan and Comey and Clapper safely in prison, and this apparatus busted into 1,000 pieces, as Kennedy said it should have been done. We'll look back at this and say, how could we have tolerated this for so long? And the injustices that were committed in the name of the American people by this shadow government, whether it's Vietnam, whether it's the destruction of Iraq, the destruction of Libya, the destruction of Syria. And then look at the American Midwest, the destruction of American cities, the destruction of the rural areas, the destruction of our once superb healthcare system
Yeah.
in search of speculative profits. At some point, we're going to look back at this and say we lost our minds. But in the meantime, our job is to make sure that we create as many sane people as possible who will stand up and get into this fight and help us win it.
Yeah. Absolutely correct, my man. Absolutely correct. Harley, the thing is that people cannot, and now it's not the time for that people be um just inoculated from being involved at a very zealous like level in this election process. And that I think we need to support our president, because there's so much such BS. Like recently, Harley, I was watching the UFC 244 fight. It was a great fight on Saturday night, and the media spinning it that when Trump entered the building that they were all booing him, and that is not the case. And I was watching the whole entire thing; they were cheering the guy, and people were, oh, look at, the media was out there saying, oh, it was all boos, it was all boos. No, it was all cheers, and there was a handful of boos, but it was all cheers.
Well, as a Houston Astros fan, I think maybe the Washington Nationals fans were booing Trump.
Yeah, they
But
were.
that's the inside the Beltway. What do you expect? That's the enemy.
Exactly.
UFC and World Wrestling Federation, they boo and cheer like crazy all the time. And to try and decide who they were booing, is absurd. But the more important point here, is the other thing that we have to look at is, again, this came out in the last few days. Christine Lagarde is
Yes.
now taking over the European Central Bank from Mario
Yes.
Draghi, who's being hailed as a hero for holding the euro together. That's an absurd formulation, because in holding it together, he destroyed Europe. But Lagarde has come out and said Germany must endorse quantitative easing. The German government is making a huge mistake by not just creating the huge volume of debt that's necessary to bail out the banks. Now, anybody who knows anything about Germany knows that even the uh, children of the World War II generation, the boomer generation, even some of the millennials, grew up hearing stories about the Weimar hyperinflation.
Yep.
The idea that you're going to force Germany to hyperinflate now, after the fact that the hyperinflation in the 20s led directly to the bankers putting Hitler in power to destroy Germany and Russia.
Yes.
It's not going to happen. And there's resistance to it. There's resistance to the Mark Carney policy for a digital currency controlled by central banks for the sake of bailing out the swindlers and their derivatives. There's resistance to the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and its austerity policies, which are destroying nation after nation. The whole world is on a march right now. And not everybody who's marching knows where they're going. But those of us who do have a responsibility to have our voices heard. And what I would emphasize for everyone is that there are simple solutions. For example, LaRouche's 4 laws, Glass-Steagall. We have to make sure there will be no bailout this time and no bail-in, that will protect people's savings and deposits and business accounts, but we will not respect or protect the swindlers' huge volumes of worthless debt. Now, if you do that and force a long-term write-down or write-off of this debt, that'll clear up a big part of the problem. And the debt I'm talking about is the junk bond debt that's been put on the books of corporations and is now sitting in the various central banks that they're using as collateral for this free money to allow more speculation. So if you start with Glass-Steagall, that's an important step. But then we need credit. And the idea of government extending credit for necessary projects in production, People who claim to be Austrian school economists and say you should never let the government control credit. Well, we've seen what a mess was made when the private sector controlled credit. Because here's one of the disconnects.
Yeah.
People in the Austrian school know that the Federal Reserve and the central banks are fraudulent institutions. They're not government agencies. They know
Correct.
that they're run by the private bankers. And yet they say the problem is government. Well, the government doesn't control the Federal Reserve. In fact, we've got to have a government that will control the Federal Reserve and either nationalize it or shut it down, and then extend credit that will go through the private banking system to the private local bankers and regional bankers who will know how to invest it so that we actually start producing. So I think we've got to solve some of the problem of the two-headed coin of the Keynesians and the Friedmanites, both of whom are monetarists. They're not based on physical economic principles. And that's one of the things that LaRouche always emphasized. So I think if we can solve some of these things, and look, we'll have to fight it out. It'll be an interesting battle. And for those of your listeners who are Friedmanites or Austrian school, let's have it out. Send me your arguments against me. We'll take it up. But these are the kinds of fights we have to have once we've defeated the swindlers and the speculators and the mass murderers and the warmongers. Once we defeat them, let's have a full open debate over how we rebuild the economy. But in the meantime, we've got to knock out these speculators and the shadow government crowd.
Absolutely. Well done. Harley, how do people contact you? How do they follow you, your work that you have posted online, any social media that you have?
Well, the best way to get what I mentioned earlier, the Barbara Boyd report on the Ukraine gate, that's at larouchepac.com. That's LAROUCHEPAC.com. To communicate with me, to get a link to my blog page so you can see what I'm writing every week, just send me an email at harleysch@gmail.com. And if you identify that you heard this on Rogue Money, I'd appreciate it, because I like to give V some props here and make sure he knows that he's got listeners who are engaged. But you want to argue with me? Fine. You want to support what we're doing? That's fine also. But let's have a robust discussion, a very forward-looking, looking to the future. Let's get rid of this pessimism of the Greta Thunberg cult and so on, and really solve some of these problems.
Absolutely. And with that being said, folks, we're at the end of the program. Subscribe, like, comment, and share. And again, go check out Harley's sites over at theschillerinstitute.org as well as larouchepac.com. With that being said, thank you all for listening. Have a great week.